Welcome to our course on FabFilter. I'm going to be covering some FabFilter plugins that you can get as part of their FabFilter 2 bundle. And since we're going to proceed in alphabetical order, the first one I'll be doing will be the Pro C2. Pro C2 is FabFilter's flagship single band compressor, and we'll be using it to compress some drums. So let me just play them without any compression. Fairly simple disco drum groove. What we want to do with the compressor is bring out a lot of the quieter elements in the drums and make them somewhat competitive with the loud kick and snares. So that's the hi-hats and the cowbells, the shakers and so on, and some of the room ambience. We're going to bring all of that up, and that's what compressors are good for. They're good at reducing the dynamic range of your signal to make the quieter elements louder and, relatively speaking, the louder elements quieter. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to crush these drums quite heavily, and we're going to mix that result with our dry drums. We're going to mix that with the dry drums to use something called parallel compression, which will give us something like the best of both worlds. We'll get the effect of the compressor as well as the solid low end from the drum loop, because heavy compression does tend to get rid of some of the low end. So without further ado, let's get started with some of these values and what they do. I'm going to stick this to practical details, and I'm not going to dive too deeply into the technical aspects of what this compressor can do. But still, I'll try to give you as much of an overview as possible. So here, the values that you're presented with would appear the same as on any compressor. You have your threshold, ratio, attack, and release values. You should first aim to set your threshold and ratios according to what you're processing, and then move on to your attack and release. And then you can start going into more nuanced work. But the base values you should be adjusting are the threshold and the ratio. The threshold simply is the volume above which the compressor will start to activate. The ratio is just the multiplier of the compression effect. So at a ratio of 2 to 1, a signal that surpasses the threshold by 4 decibels will be compressed to 2 decibels above the threshold. Likewise, a ratio of 5 to 1 will compress a signal that's 25 decibels above the threshold to 5 decibels above the threshold. So what that means is that the higher the ratio, the more intense the compression. And if you set your compression to ratio of 100 or infinity to 1, that's going to resemble a brick wall limiter. That's what a brick wall limiter is. At a 1 to 1, you're not going to get anything. So yeah, so we're going to set that after we set our threshold. So let's begin some actual sound processing here. The reason you see just the peaks is because I have this meter scale set to 9 decibels. It's probably not particularly useful for this purpose. I can only see the 9 decibels of the top peaks of the drums. That can be useful for something that has something that requires very microscopic work. But we're just going to use the 90 decibel meter scale. You can see a lot of different dynamic range in the top here. So as soon as we start bringing down the threshold, you're going to start to see this top red line, which is the compressor trace. You're going to see this top line start to dance around, and that's going to resemble your gain reduction. You can also see the peaks coming through on the actual threshold knob. So I'm going to set my threshold knob at a point where the peaks are coming past the threshold quite nicely, but also not so low that it's completely swamped by the signal. So I set my threshold to about -20, which is about the value where just the kicks and snares are popping through, but the rest of the elements are sort of sitting at that level. That means that only the kicks and snares are being compressed. If you want to be convinced of this fact, you have this little value here, or this little parameter, this headphone symbol. You can click to hold it temporarily, or you can just click it once and it'll be on forever. And this allows you to monitor the sound or solo the sound that's only coming past the compressor. It's a very cool feature. So my assumption was correct. Since I visually adjusted my threshold to approximately the level where only the kicks and the snares are coming through and not the rest of the stuff in the drum track, that means that only the kicks and snares are being compressed. Or rather, it's only the kicks and the snares are triggering the compressor. So that's fine. We've set our threshold. I want these drums to be really heavily compressed, so I'm gonna want them to go. I'm gonna want the intensity of the compression to increase. That requires me to increase the ratio. So as you can see by the trace, the higher the ratio, the deeper the gain reduction. So already there's quite a significant difference. You can try A/Bing between two different versions of your patch, of your settings. I'm just gonna A/B to a different version that doesn't have the settings that I set up. I'm not going to be using them. I'm just going to basically modulate between them just to show you the difference. So this is the version without any compression whatsoever. The threshold is at 0 decibels. So you can hear that the compressor is really biting at those drums, and it's actually starting to cut out a little bit of the transient, the initial transient. That's because it's compressing the drums as soon as the signal passes the threshold. I don't want to do it as soon as it passes the threshold. I want to do it a little bit later to allow those initial transients to break through. So I want the latter half of the drums, of the individual drum hits, to be compressed, but not the individual or not the initial transient. The way you achieve this is by increasing the attack value. So I'm going to try at about 5 milliseconds. And you can always basically take these settings that you're using, copy them over to your next version, which is your A settings are copied over to your B settings, and you can set your B settings to a lower attack and then see what that does to your sound. It's a very unique and clever feature. So a bit more of the transient is popping through. What you can also observe is this red bar over here. This is also a useful value for showing the gain reduction. It's the same thing as your gain trace here, but it's just in a more analog representation here. I think we can compress this a bit more and bring the threshold down a bit more severely to get a heavier pumping effect. Now we're getting minus 20 decibels of gain reduction. which is a bit extreme, but again, we're going to mix this in with our dry signal, and then we're going to have the best of both worlds. So at a threshold of -30, let's try changing the attack. You can see by the gain trace that we're compressing a little bit after the transient. What I want to do is get it just so you hear the initial click and not the rest. So there it's completely gone. And let's A/B that. Oh, sorry, we need to copy that over because we made some changes. Copy. And then put the attack low. So as you can hear in this, the B settings with the low attack, it's getting crushed quite heavily, and that's because the compressor is engaging immediately upon breaking the threshold. But here it's a lot tighter. You get less of an overall pumping effect, but the drums become much sharper in the mix. Next, we should look at this style value here, and when you click it, you get this drop down of different compression styles or algorithms. I want something more punchy, so I can try the punchy style. This might cause a drastic change in the volume, so make sure that you're not going to clip. So let's copy this over. I'll go to B and select our clean, which is what we were using earlier. So the clean is a bit more transparent. And basically what all these styles do is they deal with the transients in slightly different ways. Some of them are more transparent than others. Some of them are more lenient towards high dynamic range than others. So experiment with all of them and all of their different capacities. Maybe you might find that the pumping style is more suited for your mastering, which might be maybe extreme, but nevertheless you should experiment with all of them. They might fit certain contexts that they weren't really designed for. So let's go back to our A and let's try our pumping style. So there's a very evident difference in the pumping versus the clean algorithm. Alright, that's fine. So we set our attack to what we want. What we can do now is reduce our release a little bit because I feel like the release is a bit high. I want the compressor to get back up to 0 before the next kick and snare comes. I don't want the compressor to be or rather still in its slope coming up back to the top, while in between or rather I don't want the new kick and the new snare to come into the compressor while it's still recovering from the earlier one. So that means you need to adjust your release and watch the trace of the compressor to see if you're setting it correctly. So as you can see, it still hasn't reached the top, and already the next kick is coming in. So at 104, we start to get something here. It's starting to come up a bit quicker to the top. And at a release of 30, you get it's very unnatural in how fast it recovers. So the whole thing is balancing the, you're basically, it's a balancing act between having the compressor react too quickly or too slowly. You want it to be dancing just at the right level. You also want it to be rhythmically correct. You don't want it to, you can also try and just calculate the milliseconds between two quarter notes, so you can select your release time to kind of match your tempo, and that'll give you sort of a house music like pumping effect that you would get with sidechain compression. Let's A/B that. So let's just A/B this with a totally dry signal. So notice how the compressed drums sound way louder, but they're sitting at approximately the same RMS, the same volume level. So that's the effect of compression. Okay, so let's quickly visit the knee section here. The knee value is, it's simply, this graph, by the way, is a visual representation of the slope of your compressor. And the knee value, whether your knee is a softer one or a harder one, changes how gradual the transition is from signal being below the threshold to being compressed after reaching the threshold. At a harder knee or lower volume or lower decibel value of the knee, it's going to be more sharp and drastic coming up to the threshold, whereas a softer one would make the transition much longer. So I want something a bit harder because we're working with drums with quick transients. Softer knees would be used for something like vocals or violins, but hard knee is something that you want to try and use for something that has sharp, quick reductions or high dynamic range, but in very short intervals. So the softer knee values are much more transparent. Let's use a harder knee value of maybe 1 decibel and A/B that with the same thing, but with a softer knee of about 30 decibels. So you can clearly hear that the drums with the softer knee are a bit more round and full, but they don't have that sharp attack that I'm looking for. So the effect is essentially transparency. That's what the knee value is affecting. All right. Finally, once all of that is done, what you can then do is look at your wet and dry gains. So these drums are a little bit exaggerated, right? The pumping effect and so on. It's not something that you can use for your real drums in your track. They're not going to carry the low end well enough, and they're not going to really be articulated well enough to serve any rhythmic purpose. But you can use this effect in conjunction with your dry drums to then have your dry drums, but with the overall feeling of the compressed drums, and together you're going to get a very full sound. Let's bring our volume down. We're going to have two sources of volume, the dry and the wet, so you're going to probably clip if you don't change your volume. Okay, so I brought in a bit of the dry. Let me copy this over and A/B to one where there's no dry. We had about 5 decibels, so I'm going to bring this to about 5 decibels. So the difference will be perceptible. So this will be the dry, or rather the mixture of the wet and dry signals, as compared to just the wet signal, which is the B. And then you can modulate these effects. You can bring in a bit more wet on the parallel compressed version. So here you can hear that the kick is really lost. But if you bring it back with the dry gain, you get the full room feeling as well as the actual bass of the kick. And let's A/B that with a totally dry set of drums. Whoops. So listen to the shakers and the hi-hats and the congas in the two different versions. So they're brought up to the level of the snare and the kick drums in a much more apparent way than in just the dry version. So that's how you use the Pro C2 to compress your drums. You can use it for any other instrument. One more feature that I want to briefly cover in some minor detail is the sidechain feature, which is a whole other beast. But the sidechain feature allows you to actually sidechain your instruments to other instruments or other sounds. And if you've ever used an Ableton's sidechain compressor or some MIDI volume shaper, like the Volume Shaper by Cable Guys or the LFO tool by Xfer, then you'll know what this is. But this is basically Pro C2's sidechain compression unit. And the way you would set this up to be routed with an external source is a little complicated, but I'll quickly show you how it's done. First, you need to create a channel. I'm going to be using some new instruments to sidechain to, or rather, I want to sidechain a bass line to my drums. So I'm going to play them both together. So the idea is to sidechain the bass to the drums, so it kind of pumps along with the drums, and it gets out of the way when you hear the kicks and the snares. So we're gonna do that right now. First, what you need to do is you need to create a new return track. Rename that sidechain, and this is going to be you're essentially going to be sending first of all, you need to take your bass or whatever is your other instrument and apply a Pro C2 to that. And your sidechain is going to be, your sidechain compressor will be on the instrument that will be getting sidechained. The drums, you don't need to enable the sidechain. That's just, we just use the compressor to actually get a compressed set of drums, but on the bass, we'll be using it to sidechain it. So the way you do this is you enable the sidechain, you click this external button, which instructs it to receive signal from other channels in your project. And Pro C2 has its own input channel, but you need to route an external channel in Ableton to Pro C2's input. The way you would do this normally is take your drums and Audio 2. In this drop down, you would select your bass and then select the compressor here. And that would work. However, you're not going to hear the bass, or you're not going to hear the actual drums. So now you can actually hear, it is getting signal from the drums, and you can confirm that by clicking the audition button. But we can't hear the actual drums, and that's because we're sending the drum audio to the bass, the compressor, and not to the master channel. We want to send this to the master channel. But then how do we get the drum audio into the compressor on the bass? And the way that I figured out how to do this, there may be a quicker way, but this is how I do it, is you go to your sidechain return channel that you made. You want essentially to send the drum audio to this return. Well, this will be operating no matter what, no matter where your actual bass audio is going or your drum audio is going. So this will have sound going to the master channel. However, what this allows you to do is it allows you to send your drum signal to your sidechain channel, and that is going to return to your bass into your compressor. But the actual channel here will be going to the master, so you'll be able to hear it. The way you do that is you increase your C or sidechain return all the way. That means that all of the volume is coming through to the return, and then Audio 2 in the return channel would go to the bass and the compressor 2. And now it's actually compressing the bass, and we can actually hear the drums. So what you would do is click the bass here. So now we're actually compressing the bass with the drums, and we can hear the drums separately. That's pretty awesome. So now we can, what we want to do is we want to compress the bass or sidechain the bass to just the kick. How do we do that in a context where our drums have kicks and snares and hi-hats and cowbells and so on? We don't want the hi-hats and the cowbells to compress the bass. Well, the way you would do this roughly is by filtering the top end out of the drums, so only the low end, i.e. the kick, would be triggering the sidechain. So what you would do is audition your drums, click the power button here to enable your high pass filter and bring it down. And this would now be the signal that will be triggering your sidechain. So now we can disable audition. And to change the intensity of this sidechain effect, you reduce your threshold. And so in much the same way as your the threshold and ratio works under normal compression circumstances, they work the same way here. So lower values will create more obvious sidechaining. We don't want that. We want something reasonable. And you can see by the trace that it's quite smooth, even though before we had a bunch of different drums. We only have our trace responding to the kick itself. Changing the attack will give you a more immediate reaction to the kick. You might get some clicking. And the release will change how fast the compressor gets back up to 0. So now we can try that with our drums. So I'm going to A/B this just by turning off the compressor. Well, it's not particularly useful. I'll just do this with the same, by the same means as in the other, with the other compressor. Bring the threshold all the way up. Bring our gain up. So it's totally flat. It's not reacting to the drums whatsoever. And now the kick is able to live a little bit easier in the low end. So yeah, that's how you utilize the multiband effect, multiband features of the Pro C2. Once you're done with all of this, you can have a look at these values. The look ahead is the global parameter, which instructs the compressor to look ahead of itself for peaks that are, let's say, from 0 to 20 milliseconds ahead. This will give you a smoother, more transparent compression, but at the cost of CPU usage and latency. So do this only when you're rendering out everything. Likewise, the oversampling increases the quality of your sound, of your compressed sound, but at the cost of CPU. So if you want to be rendering it out, rendering out your master, your bus or whatever, then you should enable this and then render it out. But you shouldn't be using it during the mixing unless you have a very strong computer and you don't really care about added latency. And yeah, I think that's that'll be it. Thanks a lot for watching this video on the Pro C2. I hope you guys can apply some of the knowledge in your own productions. Thank you very much and have a great day.